There was this pond near where I used to live. I think it was called Grayson's Pond, but I'm not sure. The locals whispered about it, tales of eerie disappearances and strange lights at night, but to me, it was just a peaceful spot where I could escape the noise of the world. One autumn evening, with the sky painted in hues of orange and purple, I decided to hike to Grayson's Pond. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, and nostalgia pulled me towards it. I packed a small bag, grabbed my flashlight, and set off, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound accompanying me. As I approached the pond, the air grew unnaturally still. The usual chorus of wildlife was absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to thicken the air. The pond itself was mirror still, reflecting the twilight sky so perfectly it felt like you could dive into another world. For a while I just sat by the water's edge, enjoying the solitude, but then I noticed something odd. There was a faint glow emanating from the center of the pond and pulsating softly. Curiosity, or perhaps something else, compelled me to stay rather than retreat as common sense dictated. As dusk turned into night, the glow intensified and a mist began to form over the water, unnaturally cold and chilling me to the bone. That's when I heard it, a whisper, so faint it could have been the wind, but it carried my name. The voice was familiar, like an echo from a long-forgotten memory. I leaned closer, my heart pounding, when out of the mist a figure emerged, walking on the water's surface. It was translucent, shimmering with the same light as the pond. As it neared, I recognized the face. It was Mr. Grayson, the old man who had lived near the pond and had vanished years ago, presumed dead. Yet here he was, or at least some spectral version of him, his eyes hollow and his expression one of eternal searching. "Help me find my way back," the figure whispered, extending a hand that seemed to ripple like water. Panicked, I stumbled backward, my mind racing with stories of spirits bound to places they couldn't leave. I turned to run, but the path I had come by was no longer there. Instead, there was just more pond, stretching out endlessly into the darkness. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices, all those who had disappeared over the years, each asking for help and each trapped in this watery limbo. The air grew colder, my breath visible in the moonlight, now eerily blue. In my terror, I realized my flashlight had flickered to life on its own, casting a beam towards what looked like an old, submerged path leading into the pond. With no other option, and the spectral figures closing in, I stepped onto it. The water was shallow, yet every step felt like wading through time itself. As I continued to walk, the water never rose above my ankles, yet I was surrounded by ghostly figures. They didn't touch me, but their eyes followed, pleading. After what felt like hours, the path led me to the other side of the pond, which had somehow grown vast in the night. Emerging from the water, the apparitions faded, the whispers ceased, and Grayson's Pond returned to its normal size. I turned back to see the pond as serene as ever, but now with the sinister undercurrent in its stillness. I never spoke of that night, fearing disbelief or, worse, curiosity that might lead others into the same trap. But since then, whenever I hear of someone going missing near bodies of water, I wonder if they too found themselves walking on Grayson's path, looking for a way out that might never come. Back in college, I used to do a lot of hiking. I wouldn't necessarily call myself a loner, but I did like to be alone and just take in the beauty of nature. There was something about the solitude of the woods that felt like a conversation with the earth itself, a secret dialogue where the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of wildlife were the only words exchanged. One autumn, I decided to tackle a trail I hadn't explored before, known for its breathtaking views at the summit. The trail was located in a remote part of the Appalachians, less traveled due to its challenging terrain and the stories. Oh man, the stories. Locals spoke of hikers feeling watched, of strange lights, and the occasional disappearance, but I shrugged these all off as folklore meant to spook the tourists. The first day was pretty uneventful. It was filled with the crunch of leaves underfoot and the crisp air that painted my breath in front of me. As dusk fell, I set up my camp, the forest quickly swallowing the light, leaving me under a canopy of stars. That night, the forest was silent, even eerily so. No owls, no rustling of nocturnal creatures, just an oppressive quiet. The second day was when I noticed something was off. It was small things at first, like my compass spinning erratically and the feeling of being watched, which I attributed to paranoia. But as I ascended, the trail markers I expected to see were either missing or oddly defaced, symbols carved into them that I didn't recognize. By late afternoon, I should have been close to the summit, but the path seemed to loop back, disorienting me. And that's when I found it, a small clearing I hadn't seen on my map, with an ancient, gnarled tree at its center. From its branches hung dozens of small, handmade dolls, crafted from twigs and what looked like human hair. The sight sent a chill down my spine. For some reason I still don't understand, I became determined to shake off the unease, and I decided to camp there, thinking that perhaps in the morning with fresh light the path would make sense again. Night fell like a thick blanket, and with it came whispers. At first I thought it was the wind, but the words were too clear and too directed. They spoke of lost souls, of the forest claiming its due. I couldn't sleep, and as midnight approached, the dolls began to sway, though there was no breeze. Then from the shadows, figures emerged, not quite animal, but not entirely human, their movements disjointed like marionettes. They circled my tent, their whispers growing into a chant. In a panic, I grabbed my flashlight, my only weapon, and shone it towards them. The light flickered and died, but not before I caught a glimpse of faces that were too hollow, with eyes that were too knowing. With my heart pounding, I remembered an old tale about offering something to appease the spirits of the woods. Desperately, I threw out whatever I had in my pockets, snacks, a compass, even my watch. The chanting stopped, and the figures retreated, melting into the forest. At this point, I knew I wasn't going to wait for dawn. I ran, guided only by the dim moonlight filtering through the canopy, my path occasionally lit by those strange, glowing orbs the locals had mentioned. By some miracle, I stumbled upon a familiar part of the trail just as the sky began to lighten. When I finally emerged from the forest, I was miles from where I thought I should be, my gear mostly lost, my mind haunted by what I just experienced. I never hiked alone again, and whenever someone speaks of the beauty of nature, I can't help but remember the other side of that beauty, the ancient hungry side that still lurks in the less traveled paths, waiting for those who listen too closely to the whispers of the woods. A few years ago, me and some old buddies hiked into the woods to have a bro chat. We'd gone camping a few times before, but the last time was years ago. This time, we chose a trail none of us had ever been on, deep in the Pacific Northwest, known for its dense forests and remoteness. The plan was just to disconnect, reminisce, and maybe recapture some of that old magic from our younger days. The first day ended up being nearly perfect. We laughed, shared stories, and by evening, we had set up camp near a small, serene lake. That night, around the campfire, the mood was light until Jake mentioned something. Apparently he'd read about this area being uncharted territory during the early settler days, with tales of settlers disappearing without a trace. We laughed it off as ghost stories meant to scare kids. However, the next morning things felt different. The forest was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy and almost oppressive. We decided to hike further in, thinking a change of scenery would shake off the eerie feeling. That's when we found the first sign that something was off. A backpack, modern and in good condition, just lying there with no owner in sight. It was unsettling, but we rationalized it. Maybe someone had just left it behind. As we moved deeper, the signs became more bizarre. There were strange markings on trees, not like any trail markers we knew. They looked almost ritualistic. Then we stumbled upon what looked like an old campsite, but it was just wrong. The tent was set up in a clearing where no seasoned camper would ever pitch, exposed and vulnerable. Inside there were personal items, but no sign of struggle, just abandonment. By now the lightheartedness of our trip had vanished. The forest seemed to watch us, and the air grew colder as the sun dipped lower. We decided to turn back, but as dusk fell, we realized we were lost. The trails we thought we knew twisted in unfamiliar paths. And of course our phones had no signal, and our GPS devices started malfunctioning, showing us moving in circles. That night, we heard it for the first time, the sound. It wasn't animal, nor was it quite human. It was a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from all directions. That's when panic really set in. At first we tried to rationalize it, maybe went through the trees, but the consistency and the sorrow in that sound made our blood run cold. The third day, what we thought was the third, things took a turn for the surreal. We found symbols made from sticks and stones on the ground, arranged in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be random. And then, there was the figure. At first we thought it was another hiker, but it moved oddly, almost gliding, disappearing when we called out or tried to approach. Sleep was impossible now. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound was an omen. On what we believe was the fourth night, Mark, the most stoic among us, just snapped. He ran off into the woods, screaming about getting away from them. We chased after him, but the forest seemed to swallow him whole. We never found Mark. After what felt like an eternity, the remaining three of us stumbled upon a ranger station. They found us, half delirious, babbling about the woods. The rangers listened to our story with a mix of skepticism and concern. They conducted a search, but found no trace of Mark or any of the oddities we described. Eventually they concluded that it was probably dehydration, fear, and the forest playing tricks on our minds. But as we left, I saw one of the older rangers make a sign with his hands, a ward against evil, as he glanced back at the tree line. We never spoke of it again, at least not in detail anyway. Some things, when you bring them back from the depths of such places, they follow you, lurking in the silence of your thoughts. And sometimes, in the quietest moments, I still hear that wail, and I wonder if Mark, or whatever took him, is still out there in those endless woods. When I was in my early 20s, I decided to get into hiking. I'd never really done hiking hardcore before, but I figured I should at least try it out once to say I did it. So I researched and bought gear, and then packed it and chose a trail known for its scenic beauty and supposed tranquility. And then I set off into the dense woods of the Pacific Northwest. The first day was actually pretty exhilarating. The air was crisp, and the sounds of nature were soothing, and the solitude was exactly what I needed to clear my head. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I set up camp near a small, serene lake. As night fell, and I was tending to my small campfire, I heard the crunch of leaves. Turning around, I saw her, a woman. She was quite attractive, and seemed almost out of place in the rugged wilderness. Her hair was like black silk, her eyes a striking blue, reflecting the firelight. She introduced herself as Elena, a fellow hiker who had lost her group. Feeling a mix of surprise and intrigue, I invited her to share my fire. She was charming, with stories that kept me captivated well into the night. We laughed and shared some food, and there was an undeniable chemistry between us. However, as the night grew darker, her stories took a strange turn. She spoke of the forest as if it were alive, whispering secrets of old rituals and spirits that roamed these woods. At first I tried to shrug it off as her way of flirting, or perhaps just campfire stories meant to spook, but then things started to change. The next morning, she suggested we explore a less traveled path she knew. Trusting her knowledge of the area, I agreed. As we ventured deeper, the forest grew denser, the light dimmed, and an eerie silence enveloped us. Elena's demeanor shifted, her laughter turned to a cold smile, and her eyes seemed to darken. She would even disappear for moments, only to reappear with an uncanny knowledge of where I was, even when I thought I had lost her. By the third day, the playful adventure had turned into something sinister. She led us to an ancient grove, where she revealed her true intentions. Elena wasn't lost. She was something ancient, tied to the land, luring wanderers like me for a purpose I couldn't fathom. The grove was dotted with personal items, watches, rings, a hiking boot, all belonging to those who never left. Then she spoke of a pact with the spirits of the forest, requiring a sacrifice to keep the woods thriving and secretive. Her beauty now seemed like a cruel mask, her charm a trap. Panic began to set in, and I realized the stories weren't just tales, they were warnings I had foolishly ignored. I made a desperate run for it, with Elena's laughter echoing behind me, morphing into something not quite human. The forest seemed to conspire against me, roots tripping me, branches clawing at my clothes. Somehow, through sheer adrenaline and luck, I found my way back to my original path. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my heart pounding in my chest like it wanted to escape. I drove away from those woods, never looking back, but even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that Elena, or whatever she really was, is still out there. I can bet that she's waiting for her next unsuspecting hiker. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear whispers in the wind. They remind me how close I came to never leaving those woods at all.